This is an old story from China. It's called The Runaway Horse. Once at the edge of an old village in China, there lived an old man and his son. And of all the people in the village, these two were the poorest of all. And the only thing that the young man could really call his own was his horse. She was a strong mare, and every morning he'd jump on her back and ride across the fields. He'd feel the thunder in her hoofs. He loved to feel the wind in his hair. And it was the only freedom that he really ever knew. But never, ever would he ride beyond the forest. For it was said that beyond the forest lived the nomads, fierce warriors that many years ago, it was said, attacked the village and killed many of the farmers. But no one really knew when or if it was true. It was like an old story born on the lips of the villagers. Well, one day, the old man sat in front of his house on the steps, and nearby was the mare, placidly tethered to a wooden post with a leather strap. And as they stood there, suddenly the mare sensed something in the air and she started to twitch. She started to kick her back legs, and all of a sudden she was loose and began to run. And waving his arms in the air, the man ran after her, calling, "Come back! Come back! Please! Come back! Please!" But she seemed not to hear it all and ran off. And when the man got back to the village, and the other villagers heard that he had lost his only possession in the world, his horse, they quickly came, crowded into his hut, and they said, "Oh, what great misfortune! You lost your horse. Ha! Now you are twice as poor." Twice as poor. As they laughed, they quickly made their way out of the hut and left the man alone with his father, who, narrowing his eyes, looked at his son sharply and said, "How do you know this is not a blessing? How do you know?" And the young man thought to himself, "A blessing? How could that be? I've lost my only possession in the world. This is no blessing. How could that be?" Yet, it wasn't but a week later, while lying in his bed, that he heard a strange sound coming from far off. It sounded like this. Yes, it was the horse's hoofs. And he got up on his elbows and looked out his window, and sure enough, there was his mare coming back to his house. And following the mare was a great, big war horse, a stallion. The mare had gone through the herds of the nomads and had let loose a most exquisite specimen, a humongous war horse. Well, soon enough, the other villagers heard that he had a stallion, and they came to his hut, and they gathered inside his hut, and they looked at him and they said, "Oh, you are very fortunate. Now you have 2 horses, twice as many as one. If you keep this up, you could be a horse trader." Horse trader. And as they pushed themselves into one another, they quickly made their way for the door. And the old man was alone with his father once again. And his father narrowed his eyes, looked at him deeply and said, "How do you know this is not a great misfortune? How do you know?" And the young man thought to himself, he said, "Misfortune? How could it be a misfortune? I had 1 horse. Now I have 2. It's a perfect mating pair. Nothing could be better. What does he mean, misfortune? What does he mean?" And yet, it wasn't but a week later that the young man was riding his horse. And no, he wasn't riding the young mare that was used to him. No, the young man jumped on the back of the great stallion. But the great stallion was not used to this kind of rider. It was too light of a load, and he didn't know how to ride. And he got a little spooked. And all of a sudden, he started galloping faster and faster and faster through the village. And soon they were outside of the village, running faster into the fields and then into the forest. And the man could only do nothing but hold on for dear life. And as they entered the forest, limbs from the trees were going right by his face. And the only way he could hold on was to wrap his fingers tightly into the horse's mane and hold on for dear life. And suddenly, the horse reared back and the man was thrown to the ground. And as he hit the ground, he broke his hip. And he laid there on the forest floor in the darkness, crying into the sky, screaming, "Ah!" in pain. And lucky for him, his screams of pain were heard by some of the villagers, who, entering the forest unlike they normally do, they came to him and they found him and carried him back to the village. And when they laid him down in his bed, they said, "Oh, you broke your hip. You will never be the same." Oh. And the man sat there all alone, and his father looked at him, and he narrowed his eyes, and he said, How do you know this is not a great blessing? How do you know?" And the young man thought, a great blessing. And the doctor of the village came to him, told him that he had broken his hip and that he may never walk again. And he sat in bed waiting. And weeks became 2 weeks. And 2 weeks became a month. And a month became 2 months, and 6 months, and a year. And he sat waiting. And some days he would hear the children playing outside his door. And he thought if he would ever walk again. Until one day, from the four corners of the village, he heard the gongs clamoring from afar. And he got himself up on his elbows to look out his window. And what he saw was all the other villagers running in all different directions, some holding pitchforks, others holding staves and sticks and shovels, for they didn't have any real weapons. And then off, farther into the distance, he could see the nomads charging across the field toward the village. And in the battle that ensued, 9 of the villagers that fought to defend their lives lost their lives. And the young man, unable to fight by no fault of his own, survived the battle and went on to live a long life, although be it with a limp. And so the Chinese say that just below a blessing lies a disaster. But perched just above a disaster, one finds a blessing. And it is very difficult to know